his suffering and how that is the important part of how Jesus's death on the cross and him being the ultimate surrogate is how God is working with the people to liberate everyone. Williams, on the other hand, that's not her point, right? For her, she's focusing on Hagar and then Jesus as part of how understanding how, because of Black women's experience, women's suffering cannot be part of the liberation understanding, and surrogacy cannot be part of that understanding, and therefore there needs to be a different reading of Jesus' story, and that's why she turns to ministry. Here are a couple of art pieces that I think are very helpful. If we were in class, which I miss y'all, but if we were there, I would say, what do you see? So pause the video here, take a second, and really look, what do you see in this picture? This is Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. So pause, what do you see? Okay, hopefully you did pause and you did take a break to really analyze what's happening in this image. As you can see, there's an obvious age difference, right? And Hagar, even though she's described as an Egyptian slave, that doesn't really say anything about her race. And so European artists have decided to showcase her as, or show her as a white woman. But the biggest thing is the age difference between both her and Sarah and her and Abraham, and also how Sarah is sort of pushing her hand towards him, right? In an attempt to have them have Ishmael, right? Have a child. Here are other parts of the Hagar story. Hagar in the desert with Ishmael, and Hagar in the wilderness, right? These are more contemporary understandings, but here I think you see a little bit more, even though it was present here in Hagar's face, here you see more of her pain in motherhood, right? And the precarity of her situation in her motherhood. But pause here, take a look at these art pieces, and then tell yourself what you see or what you think is interesting. We ended class yesterday on our Monday, looking at this main concept of surrogacy, right? And I outlined why, and this is how Williams is tracing surrogacy, right? Through Hagar, then the historical reality for Black women as slaves, and further on, and then Jesus, and landing on her claim that surrogacy cannot be redemptive, right? So she moves into ministry as a way of how Jesus had transformational relationships and sees that as the moment of salvation. So for Williams, liberation is not something that's granted by God. That's sort of how we ended class, right? And I said that it's hard theology, right? It's hard to comprehend, it's hard to grasp, especially given all that we've read so far. And I confess to you, and I confess every year when I teach Williams, it's hard to think of a God who is not active in his participation of salvation, right? He was through Jesus. We get that's how Williams thinks God is active, but not constant. And instead, God, who did very little to liberate Hagar, who does not do that for Black women in history in quite the same way. For Williams, liberation is not granted by God. God does very little to liberate. And instead, God functions as a witness to that liberation. So, and going back to the Jesus, right? Jesus demonstrates in his ministry, not his suffering. It is through his witnessing of the people at the time, of their needs, of their human experiences, and helping those that need it more. That's how William conceives of liberation. Here, I'm going to play a short video and take a couple of notes about what it says about looking away versus witnessing. I think turning again to John Green, who as this class has used in the very beginning, to sort of think through about the power of looking away and witnessing. So I'm gonna go ahead and play it, and then I'll ask a couple of questions to sort of guide you to conclusions.
Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. This video is about looking away, and you may need to look away at some point, and I totally understand that, but I hope that you'll stick with me. So when Sarah and I went to Sierra Leone, we visited the only hospital in Kono District, Koidu Government Hospital, which has come a very long way. Like when Partners in Health began supporting the hospital in 2014, there was no consistent electricity or running water, the maternity ward had a dirt floor, there was no emergency department, no blood bank, no functioning x-ray machines. After the devastations of colonialism, Sierra Leone had never had much money to build up a healthcare system, but the system was further weakened first by the Sierra Leone Civil War and then by a horrifying Ebola outbreak. 5 years later, when I visited, KGH was a vastly different place. Clean maternity wards, a functioning emergency department, a laboratory to diagnose illness, and plentiful stocks of medication to treat it, along with many well-trained healthcare workers. And this is reflected in child and maternal health: more safe deliveries, fewer stillborn babies, and a dramatic reduction in the so-called decision-to-incision time, the amount of time between when the need for an emergency C-section is identified and when that procedure actually happens. Because these are emergency surgeries meant to save the mother and baby's lives, the sooner the procedure can happen, the higher the likelihood of a positive outcome. And just a couple years ago at KGH, the decision-to-incision time was often over 3 hours. Today, it is an average of 1 hour, 8 minutes. But the hospital is still woefully inadequate. There are only 48 maternal beds to serve a population of 500,000 people, and there's no NICU, no incubators or ventilators. There's only very basic equipment to try to save sick kids. And when we were at KGH, I saw a mother with a young child in the pediatric ward, and without going into details, I think the child was probably dying, and I looked away. I looked away because I didn't want to gawk, and because I didn't know what I could do in that moment to help, and because it was awful to see a mother in that kind of pain and to see a child suffering. But there was also something else. I've worked in a children's hospital. I've held the hands of kids as they died. I understand that children sometimes die, but most kids who die in Sierra Leone die of conditions we know how to treat or prevent, and most mothers who die in childbirth die for want of an ambulance ride or a blood transfusion or an emergency C-section. These deaths are preventable, and they have been for decades. 6 years ago, I made a video from Ethiopia called Looking Away about the importance of listening to and supporting people living in absolute poverty. 6 years ago. In those 6 years, I had done some things and given some money, but I had not made a serious commitment to listen better or to focus on the needs of the poor in an ongoing way. So I wasn't just looking at a child who was dying, I was looking at a child who very possibly wouldn't be dying if I had understood earlier the scope of the problem and devoted more of my resources to supporting the people who are solving the problem. And I think ultimately that is also part of why I looked away again. I had understood in the abstract that the maternal and child mortality crises in Sierra Leone were emergencies, but I hadn't been treating them like emergencies, and now I was faced with the consequences of that. The truth was, I wasn't doing nearly enough with the money and power and platform I'd lucked into to support truly vulnerable people, and I'm still not doing enough, but I am trying to do more, not just with my money and with my time, but also with my attention. On that front, Partners in
Amazing. Oops, that was not what I meant to do. There it is. Okay, so in this video, Green highlights two different ways or two different reasons why we look away, right? We look away because it's hard for us. It's hard for us to witness what is happening. And also we look away because sometimes looking feels like gawking, right? It feels judgmental or like it's happening out of uh, um, and a selfish reason, right? And so take a couple of minutes, maybe 5 minutes, pause the video here after I ask you the question and journal to yourself, why do we sometimes look away? why do we know why we do it when it's easy, right? When it affects us, but look, how does looking away sometimes help those who we are observing, right? If you saw someone trip and they fell and now they're embarrassed, like looking away feels like the right thing to do. Um, and then also how is sometimes that same looking away not a good thing. So stop here, pause, and think a little about looking away versus witnessing and those themes and journal on it. So journal on it for 5 minutes and then come back to the video. Okay, so
Good morning,
hopefully
Hank. Good morning.
you're back from your 5 minutes of journaling. And this is the connection I wanted to highlight for today about Oliva's writing, right? So Oliva on page 267 writes, "So don't look away, mark the injustices, bear witness to the detention centers and the courtrooms and the articles and the cover-ups and the damage done. But that attention must be reinforced, undergirded, held aloft by busy hands and continued work, even when that work is hard or boring or seemingly pointless." And I want to tie that to the fact that Hagar named God, right? She's one of the only, if not the couple of figures in the Bible who gave God a name. And she named God the God who sees. But Oliva pushes that and says, yes, you have to witness. You have to see it. You don't look away, right? You don't look away like John Green says that he did, right? And he now feels bad about it. Um, But you bear witness so that the things don't go unnoticed. But she also says that has to be held aloft by busy hands, right? It has to be part of the work. It has to be accompanied with work. You have to do things. And here she's talking about how she never realized how so much of the work was going to be tedious, right? In an office, et cetera, et cetera. But like that is the work. A work that is annoying or boring or full of spreadsheets or yes, and so knowing that and knowing what you read for today on Oliva, think about what work you think needs to be done, right? We all are going to be witnesses to different injustices because of our own hermeneutic, our own lens, right? So for you, the detention centers, although they have importance, may not be as I don't want to say as relevant because that's not correct, right? But you have a cause, right, that drives you, an injustice that fuels you. And so what is that tedious work? What does that look like, right? There's um an understanding in union work, right? Of like, yeah, everybody wants to do the big things, but nobody wants to wash the dishes at the end of the meeting. And so think about times where you're going to be willing to wash the dishes, to do the messy work. Um, and if there are no causes for you that move you in the same way, ask yourself why, and try and find them. And hopefully this class has inspired a little bit of that. And then also think about the name of God as the one who sees, right? We've talked about God as mystery. We talked about God as mother, God as father, God as that with no name, God as more than just a being, God as I am who I am, right? That's another biblical reference. But what does it say about a God who sees? Um, a God who witnesses, right? There's also like a disabilities, a theology of disability claim and seeing, right? Not everybody sees, but everybody witnesses, right? That's the difference between witnessing and seeing, is that witnessing is more than just watching with your eyes, right? There's something about it. So think about it, and write down other connections you see between Oliva's work and Williams's work. And then hopefully I'll see you next Monday for those of you who have come to the end of the video, right, you now should have access to the quiz. It's a 10-minute quiz like in class, all multiple choice and fill in the blank. It'll be graded automatically, I hope, and so your grade should be in right away. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday.